Shadowlands as our very first screening for this semester. Um, Dr. Asma Faiz, who is very kindly agreed to moderate this event at rather short notice. Apologies for the confusion around this. पहले अमीन ने जो है वो हामी भर ली करने की because of his love for Karachi and Nida's work, and then later he realized कि उनकी अपनी class होती है इसी time पे. So clearly his priorities, you can tell what they are. But thank you so much, Asma, for stepping in at the rather sort of late in the day to rescue us. For many reasons, as many of you know, Dr. Asma Faiz is an expert on political violence, on the politics of sin. And these are some of the very sort of key themes of Dr. Nida Kirmani's film. So I think we're in very sort of exciting hands to sort of moderate this event, and I'll hand things over to her to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Aman, and thank you, Ghazal. And I think there couldn't be a better start to the HSS seminar series. It's a wonderful documentary. I think I have an advantage over most of you because I've seen it, so I know what I'm talking about. It was short notice, and I got a bout of confusion in the morning when I saw the poster, so I thought maybe I'm not, doing this. Let me say a very quick word about Dr. Nida Kirmani, then she has, a few words to share about the documentary before we actually get down to the business of documentary. Now, usually when we do the introduction, this is a formal way of saying the speaker does not need an introduction. In this case, actually does not need an introduction. She is so well known within LUMS, outside Pakistan, academia, public space. I'm just going to say just 2-3 lines that Dr. Nida Kirmani is Associate Professor of Sociology in the Mushtaq Ahmed Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences. She's a feminist public intellectual. Dr. Kirmani has published extensively on issues relating to gender, Islam, women's movement, development, and urban studies. And also her book, Questioning the Muslim Woman, Identity and Insecurity in an Urban Indian Locality, was published in 2013 by Routledge. And Dr. Nida Kirmani has come up with it has been very prolific when it comes to the question of political violence and everyday life in Lyari in many publications. So, Nida, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Aman and Ghazal, for inviting me as part of the HSS seminar series. Thank you, Asma, for that very generous introduction. I think people know, some people know me, but maybe they don't know me they know me for the right reasons, but they probably don't know that much about my research in Lyari. And so it's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to share some of this research with you all today. I think I've presented a previous paper that I wrote about feminism and fun and the relationship between the pursuit of enjoyment and leisure and how young people in Lyari are pushing gender boundaries. And actually there was a short documentary that was also made to go along with that paper, which I think I screened at LUMS as well. But anyway, this is actually might be my third presentation on Lyari at LUMS. I also presented once on the People's Aman Committee and the relationship between state and non-state actors. And some of that is very, very relevant to the screening today and to the documentary. Before we get into the documentary, which is only 31 minutes long, and I think I'm happy that it's gotten a lot of attention, but I also think it puts a lot of pressure on the film and on me. It's just an attempt. It's just a short little documentary that we made, and it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect. And I'm really happy to hear your critical comments in the discussion after. There's a lot that I myself am critical of in terms of the documentary as well. I think many of us are critical of our work, especially once it's done and out there, we're like, oh my God, how did I publish this? Or how did I make this? In this case, how did I produce this documentary? I am very proud of this work, but it's also, it's a work in progress. And I would welcome any critical comments that you might have. I want to tell you a little bit about Lyari before we actually watch the film, just to give you a sense of the context. It will help you understand more of the dynamics, what you're seeing in the film. Lyari is a place that many people in Pakistan might have heard about before. How many of you all are from Karachi? हाँ, तो अगर आप कराची के हैं तो you probably have heard quite a bit about Lyari. But maybe you've heard just about gangs and Lyari is a no-go area and Lyari is a very dangerous, fearful kind of place. I hope this documentary doesn't reinforce those ideas. It might, but what we're also trying to do is to also show the side of people who are affected by the conflict, but who might not have been directly involved in the conflict. So how are the majority of people in Lyari who were not necessarily part of gangs themselves, how were they affected by the conflicts that took place in their part of the city? And so that's really, and the film is, you'll see it, it's about violence, but it's also trying to give you a sense of life, how life moves on alongside violence and conflict. So when conflict takes place, even at the time that conflict is taking place, everyday life, as we call it, is also taking place at the same time. What does that everyday life look like? How do people experience that kind of, living with that kind of violence? So the film is really trying to get at that. What is the texture of life in a place that has gone through so much conflict for so long? Here on the map, Lyari is known by outsiders as a no-go area, but by the people who live in Lyari, people who are from Lyari, they know of their area as Karachi ki maan, or the mother of Karachi, because Lyari is seen as one of the original settlements of the city. Lyari was there well before Pakistan was ever even conceived of in anyone's imagination. And we can argue about whose imagination, but that's for a different seminar. But Lyari was there since at least the 18th century. It was a fishing village. Karachi itself was a fishing village. People migrated from the entire region to this area because you can see that Lyari is right near the sea. It's right near the port. And so that's very important for the history of Lyari, the development of this area. The port has served as a major source of employment for people in Lyari as well. So the people who are living there, either they have family members who are working in the Karachi Port Trust, or their ancestors would have worked in the port or in the fishing industries. So a lot of the employment in the area is tied with the sea. Lyari is not a neighborhood. It is many, many neighborhoods. It is almost probably 1.5 million people, the population of Lyari. So it's not a neighborhood. It's many neighborhoods. And the film only is able to focus on some of those areas. It's very densely populated. It's covering, you can see on the map, it's not huge. It's here in Karachi's District South. It's, I guess, 1,800 acres, whatever that means. I'm not good at measuring land, but it's very densely populated, extremely ethnically diverse. And that's one of the things that makes Lyari so beautiful as well. It's like you can hear every language that's spoken in Pakistan within Lyari. And some of those languages you'll also hear in the film as well. But Lyari is known for being a Baloch area, right? So just going back, if Lyari's population is 1.5 million, Karachi's population now is about, and this is also contentious, about, as everything in Karachi is, about 20 million. So Lyari is a significant part of the city, a very huge mega city. At the time of partition, Karachi's population was only 350,000. So Karachi has also changed and expanded extremely dramatically and exponentially. Lyari also has expanded and changed with the evolution of the city as a whole. Lyari's population is about, even though it's known as a Baloch area, it's about 50% Baloch. So that's very significant. But that means that another 50% is people from almost every other ethnic community that exists in Pakistan. The Kutchi community has a very strong presence in Lyari as well. So people who would have migrated, again, before partition from what is the Kutch area of Gujarat. So they're about 30% of the population, and then you have Punjabis, and you have Urdu speakers, or Muhajirs as they're known in Karachi, and Pashtuns, and every kind of person is there in Lyari. Religiously also very diverse. You have a significant Hindu population, significant Christian population. Every single kind of Muslim that exists also lives in Lyari. It sounds like an ad for Lyari, right? So you should all visit Lyari. It's a wonderful place. But it's also a place that's been through a lot of violence and a lot of trauma. And a lot of that violence and trauma is attributed to these gangs that emerged in Lyari in the early 2000s. So in the early 2000s, this gentleman who is here, this guy, his name is Rahman Daket. So many of you might have heard of him. Rahman Daket became very powerful during the early 2000s. And Rahman was involved in a lot of criminal activities, smuggling, drug dealing. But he was also involved, as many people like him, I mean, he's not exceptional, in a lot of social work as well. So he was kind of like a Robin Hood figure in Lyari. And he also started to think of himself and frame himself as a leader in his own right. So, shuru mein he was Rahman Daket. By the end of his life, he became Sardar Rahman Baloch. Jabki Rahman had no major kind of tribal, he had no tribal authority, right? So he kind of framed himself as a Sardar, as a tribal leader. And is poster mein bhi aapko nazar aa raha hai, which is heavily photoshopped, that he, he's wearing a turban, and that is Uzair Baloch on the right. So they're also presenting themselves in this kind of fashion of a Sardar as a tribal leader. They're celebrating Baloch Culture Day in 2013. I actually went to their gathering in 2013 of Baloch Culture Day. I was just trying to figure out what is going on. I started doing my research in Lyari in 2012. In 2012, Uzair Baloch was the kind of big man in Lyari. He was the, everyone would call him Bhai, as we do in Karachi and other parts of South Asia, for the kind of local leader that exists. So Uzair became the head of the gangs after Rahman was killed in 2009 in a police encounter. So you'll see some of that in the documentary as well, because the woman who's, one of the women who's featured in the documentary is Amna Baloch. Her husband was a close affiliate of Rahman, and he was also killed in the encounter in which Rahman was killed in 2009. And everyone knows that an encounter is an extrajudicial killing. So it's a kind of euphemism that we use in South Asia for extrajudicial killings. And so Amna's husband was killed alongside Rahman. One of the reasons why Rahman might have been killed, and we're always speculating here about, because we never really know why, was that he was becoming extremely powerful in his own right. Rahman was known to be very closely affiliated with the Pakistan People's Party. So in this poster here, you can see on your right is Zulfiqar Mirza, who was the home minister at the time in the People's Party government in Sindh. And so Zulfiqar Mirza, in many ways, owned the gangs that lived in Lyari. He came on television and he bragged about giving thousands of weapons licenses to the Lyari gangs. People who know Karachi, who've lived through the conflicts that have affected that city, know that there was a conflict between the other very powerful political party that now is no longer powerful, the MQM, the Muttahida Qawmi Movement, which used to be the Muhajir Qawmi Movement, then became the Muttahida Qawmi Movement. There was a tussle between the PPP and the MQM during the early 2000s. And so some people speculate that perhaps the People's Party supported the gangs because they needed a counterforce to the MQM, which was extremely powerful in Karachi, right? And MQM was also infamous for its violence and target killings and extortion. And the gangs that became powerful in Lyari were also infamous for extortion, what we call bhatta, right? And involved in various criminal activities. So they, in many ways, mimicked the MQM in the way that they were operating, in their structure. The People's Aman Committee, which was created before Rahman died and was headed by Rahman and then by Uzair Baloch, acted as a kind of pseudo-state within a state within Lyari. They ran the show in Lyari. And so the People's Aman Committee, and you can see with the name, they also kind of People's Party, People's Aman Committee, they never had an official relationship with the People's Party, but these posters were everywhere. And everyone could see that there was some relationship between the People's Party and the People's Aman Committee. They would visit their houses. Uzair Baloch ke yahan aate the, you know, dawat pe. When I was there once, iftari pe, you know, well, I didn't hang out with Uzair Baloch a lot, but I did interview him, I think, twice in the beginning of my fieldwork. Along with the People's Party, there's another person on this billboard that I think it's important just to highlight. He was the Chief of Army Staff in 2013 when this photo was taken, Ashfaq Kiani. So there was a lot of speculation that the gangs might have also had support from the military. And we can talk about why, but like I said earlier, Lyari is known as a Baloch area, and for many people in Balochistan, Lyari is extremely important symbolically, emotionally, and politically as well. So a lot of nationalist organizing, Baloch nationalist organizing, would have taken place in Lyari because, you know, Karachi is so close to Balochistan and there's so much travel between Balochistan and Karachi. And so this was a hub for Baloch nationalist activities as well. So there's a lot of speculation that perhaps the gangs might have been given support from the state as a counter to any kind of Baloch nationalist activism or activity that might have taken place. Of course, we're always speculating in Pakistan. We never really know for sure. But this is, you know, these are some of the ideas that the residents of Lyari also espouse and shared with me throughout my years of fieldwork. The film is really telling the story of just two people, Amna Baloch and Nawaz Lassi, both of whom lost family members in the conflict. Amna lost her husband, and Chacha Nawaz Lassi, lost 4 sons, 2 sons in inter-gang violence and 2 sons in police encounters. So a big part of the political project that we had behind this film was to also highlight the issue of encounters, because encounter killings happen all over South Asia, all over Pakistan. In Karachi, we've seen thousands of encounter deaths over the last 2 decades, at least. और उस पे हम लोग कभी बात नहीं करते हैं. It's kind of like you just see a number and you go, okay, that's great, they're controlling crime. But you never really think about who are the people that were killed, what were their stories, what were their crimes, what happened to their families. So for us, a big point of this film is to really highlight some of these stories as well. When I say us, it wasn't just me that was involved in the film. There was the director, whose name is Dostan Baloch. दोस्तान के साथ मैंने 2 और भी छोटी डॉक्यूमेंट्रीज बनाई थी. एक तो वो खेल खेल में जिसके बारे में मैंने अभी बात की थी about gender and pushing gender boundaries, that's on YouTube. और फिर एक डॉक्यूमेंट्री है Dawn अखबार के नाम से, which is about a tabloid newspaper that was very influential in Lyari. वो भी YouTube पे आपको मिल सकती है. They didn't have any budget. So I'm just giving you a disclaimer. They're pretty amateur, but I think they're only 14 minutes long. If you have time, you might want to watch them. इसके लिए थोड़ी सी budget थी हमारे पास, इतनी भी नहीं थी, लेकिन थोड़ी सी थी. And that budget came from a grant from an organization called EdJam, Education, Justice and Memory Project, which is organized out of the UK, out of the University of Bristol. And EdJam was funding projects that are looking at how do we teach and learn about our violent past. So they funded projects all over the world, not just here. So I think 18 countries में उनके projects हैं, and this is one of the projects that they funded. So we're very grateful to them. I'm also very grateful to the support I've received throughout from Hina, who I pressured to come here today, even though she has so much work to do, and Nasir, And our admin staff has been so amazing in helping just make sure that the project worked smoothly. And I'm very thankful to Dostan, the director, and the editor, whose name is Hussein Qaiser. And if anyone's ever made a film, some of you have, I know, you know the editor's job is extremely important. I didn't realize how important. Bichara Hussein, we gave him hours of footage and said, yaar, aap iske saath kuch kar lena, story bana le. And he really helped us craft the narrative. So he deserves a lot of credit for this. This lady, her name is Nasima Amma. Nasima's story was also supposed to be featured in the film. Isme teen stories thi. Chacha Nawaz, Amna, and Nasima. But in the end, we decided for various reasons not to include Nasima's story. I can talk about those in the discussion. She also lost 4 sons in the conflict. So these stories, and she passed away a few months ago. And so I just want to remember her, acknowledge her, because all 3 of these people were so generous with us. Like, they opened their homes, they opened their families, they shared their pain, they shared their trauma. And it's not easy, and it's not easy because it's so painful and difficult, but also because it's risky for them. So they made a choice to share this story, because jo conflict Lyari mein chal rahi thi pichle 20 saal se, wo abhi tak khatam nahi hui hai. And so that threat of violence is always still hanging over people there. And so they've also really taken a risk by allowing their stories to be told in this way. So I just want to acknowledge all of them. The film is only 31 minutes long. It is upsetting. You already know the subject, so you're mentally prepared for it. That's my little trigger warning for you. So just, it is what it is. But please watch the film. I don't know if I should say enjoy, because the subject matter is not super enjoyable, but look forward to discussing with you after. Thank you.
Thank you, Nida. Thank you for making this documentary. Second time I'm seeing it, and it's such an emotional story. I mean, one could think about, some academic questions, but it's also such a human story. So many people caught up in such terrible circumstances. Each time that I've seen it, I feel like saying this. I didn't say it last time, but I feel like, ordinary people who are caught up in such extraordinary circumstances, just the fact that Chacha Nawaz and Amna are able to go on with their lives, it's amazing, almost superhuman ability. And of course, you have interacted with them so much. One thing that I wanted to ask you, well, actually, 2-3 things. One, I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges that you might have, and I'm sure there must have been many challenges when you were making the documentary, and it's not easy in such a short space of time to talk about. Also, this is a very, in some sense, soul-wrenching, gut-wrenching kind of an experience. If you could just share with us a little bit about some of the bigger challenges that you faced while you went deep into this project. I also I'm tempted to ask about Amma Nasima, because you said that it's also that she passed away, but it's also that her story couldn't really come. So were there some other extenuating circumstances? If it is okay to talk about that, then please do talk about it. One more, sort of a political question, because Lyari is also it used to be known as People's Party's headquarters. I mean, Zulfikar Mirza, who was the Home Minister in Sindh at the time, and you continuously go back to Lyari, you know the place very well. So, how is it looking in terms of political party presence? Because all of the parties and the state agencies, everybody had their hands full and dirty while they were playing with people's lives in Lyari. So does People Party, are people sick and tired in Lyari of People's Party and its association with People's Aman Committee? How does it look like in terms of political attitudes?
Thanks, Asma. That's a lot of questions, and a lot of questions with kind of long answers. Challenges, bahut the, obviously. One of the big challenges was time. Ideally, for a documentary to be really well done, you should have a long time. So, abhi I think law school mein bhi ek documentary film festival hone wali hai shayad. There's a documentary in there called All That Breathes, which you really should watch if you haven't seen it. I think that documentary took 8 years to make, and it shows because of the depth that they're able to capture and the kind of texture of life that it takes to capture. It takes that long. And like I said, we got this funding in April. We shot the film mostly last summer, over 2 months. It's really not a lot of time. और जब हमने शुरू किया, so we had no idea like what we were going to cover, whose stories, how it was going to look, what the structure would be. We just kind of went in and started collecting stories. So the first thing we did was we did focus group discussions, as sociologists like to do sometimes. लोगों को जमा करना और फिर आप 3-4 सवाल उनसे पूछते हैं, and it's kind of an awkward type of interaction that you have trying to glean some information from them. So उन focus groups को भी हमने film किया, and we did those focus groups in like 4 different localities in Lyari. And we weren't sure, would we use these focus groups, would we not? But one thing we were trying to do was to look for stories that we really wanted to hone in on. So हमें लगा, and how we imagined the documentary before was that there would be some focus groups, और फिर हम कुछ लोगों को पे ज़्यादा focus करेंगे और उनकी stories को ज़्यादा detail में बताएंगे. But we realized that the focus groups they weren't like very compelling in terms of like storytelling. तो हमने फिर उनको शामिल नहीं किया. A major challenge was people are afraid still to talk about what happened, and obviously आप जहाँ रह रहे हैं, even अगर आप directly involved नहीं थे gangs में, लेकिन maybe your next door neighbor was, maybe your cousin was, maybe your family member was, somebody might have been involved. So either you could be putting them at risk by exposing them, or you could be attracting some kind of retribution at a time where these groups might become powerful again. So a lot of people, very understandably, are very hesitant to share their stories. So इतने कम time में लोगों का trust gain करना, that's very challenging. And then you also you want to be ethical in the way that you're doing research. You don't want to like do anything covert. You don't want to pressure anyone to share their story either if they're not ready for it or they're not aware of the risks that they might be facing. So बहुत challenges थे. I mean, and then these 3 people who we decided to focus on, like I said, extremely courageous and generous. Amna is out there all the time. And Amna she's already kind of exposed. तो वो protest में जिस तरह से आपने देखा protest में जाती हैं, बोलती हैं, Facebook पे बहुत, social media पे बहुत active हैं. So she's not hiding her political position or her background. और उनके लिए I think it was important to be part of this project because she wanted to tell her side of the story. तो जिस तरह से उन्होंने कहा कि people are talking about her behind her back all the time. So she really wanted to be able to share her own story. So that was, I think, the reason why she was so open. And Chacha Nawaz, I mean, I hope he has a long life, but I think he's, probably thinks of himself as being towards the end of his life. And I think he feels like he doesn't have perhaps a lot to lose, or maybe unke liye itna risky nahi hai iske bare mein baat karna. So he was open to sharing his story, but getting other people to be that comfortable was challenging, and to do so in a way that we also felt was ethical was also challenging. And I'm not sure that we've done that. I still have questions about that myself, which I'm happy to talk about. And जो दूसरा सवाल है, नसीमा अम्मा की story हमने इसलिए शामिल नहीं की because when we were putting the stories together, Hussein, the editor, actually said, what purpose is her story serving? Because एक चाचा नवाज की story है, उन्होंने भी 4 उनके बेटे चले गए. He's living, he's really struggling, as you can see. And it's not a story of hope and resilience, right? Even if he's a charming man and he's, tries to be as positive as he can be. Lekin it's, his story is sad. And there's really and Amna's story is sad too, But Amina's also resisting. There's a story of resistance and resilience there. So we thought, ye jo do stories hain, if we put them side by side, then perhaps, there's some kind of, you're seeing, at least there's many sides of how people experience this kind of trauma. There's not just two ways of experiencing it, but at least we're showing some kind of contrast between this kind of, I really didn't want this to be a story of victimhood, and I didn't want it to be this kind of violence porn or poverty porn that we always see कि आप गरीबों की stories film कर रहे हैं और शेयर के देख रहे हैं यार बेचारे कितने तकलीफ से रह रहे हैं and everyone says oh that's so sad. So I really didn't want this film, and I hope it's not that. So Amina's story was important for us to include. Naseem Amma की story इतनी sad थी कि फिर बहुत ज़्यादा victimhood की तरफ चला जाता. Because she also lost, and she really did. I mean, she worked as a domestic worker her whole life. She made, a pittance like most domestic workers do. And then she got ill, and it's really very sad. And so it was just too much sadness. And so we thought just the two made more sense in terms of what we were trying to do. Our People's Party still has a lot of support in Lyari. They've had support in Lyari since the 70s, and there's reasons for that. उन्होंने बहुत काम भी किया Lyari में, उन्होंने infrastructure पे बहुत काम किया, उन्होंने universities बनाई, उन्होंने अस्पताल बनाया, उन्होंने सड़कें बनाई. Lyari has and I'm not, again, not an advertisement, but I'm trying to explain why people would still support the People's Party despite the fact that they did also have links with these groups. And many people were also very angry and disheartened by that, and abhi bhi hain. And that's why in 2018, jab election hua tha, to a lot of people were very surprised because Lyari se ek seat TLP ko gayi thi. Some people might remember that. And Lyari has been known for being, one of the reasons many of us love Lyari is because it's been known for being like a relatively more secular, relatively more democratic kind of space within Karachi. It has a history of leftist organizing, union organizing, labor organizing, और जो क्योंकि इतनी diversity वहाँ है, तो you also see that there's a lot of tolerance for difference, ethnic difference and religious difference. So people were very surprised कि TLP को किस तरह से seat मिली है Lyari से. But one of the reasons perhaps that the TLP might have won is because people were very angry and upset about the People's Party's role in the conflict that took place there. I don't know, agar, next election jab bhi ho, I don't know if the TLP would win again. But, there's a lot of protest vote that's taking place and genuine support for those parties as well. And so the political situation it's not as clearly a PPP stronghold as it used to be. But abhi bhi hai.
Why did you feel the need to make a documentary around encounters? What was the inspiration behind it? Like, did you just suddenly get a brainwave that I should probably make a documentary on it, or was it something else that inspired you? And along those lines, similarly, do you think that if you had more time, you could have probably, say, gotten more of what you wanted from it? Because I know you said that you wanted to make the documentary around encounters, but around halfway point, like a lot of the times when people were telling the story, it became misery porn. Like, unfortunately, I have to say this, that it moved from encounter to how the survivors are more or less surviving around. Do you think that if you had more time, you'd be able to build a narrative more so around the encounters that you wanted?
Yeah, so I said earlier, it's not a film about encounters. For me, it was important to highlight the issue of encounter killings, but the film is intended to be a film about how people live with violence or the after effects of violence. What does it mean to live in a place that has experienced this kind of conflict? How do people live with that kind of pain and trauma? So agar किसी point पे या कई points पे आपको misery porn लग रहा है, it's because it is about the experience of pain and loss. That is the subject of the film. And for me, personally, encounters are an important theme that I think should be discussed generally and after the film. लेकिन जब हमने ये project शुरू किया था, तो there was no intention in the team's mind कि हम encounters पे film बना रहे हैं. It's just that the people that we ended up focusing on are all victims of, their family members are victims of encounter killings. तो क्योंकि फिर जो हमें लोग मिले या जो characters थे film में, they were victims of encounter, family members were victims of encounters. और मेरे लिए, personally, as Nida Kirmani, I think encounters are something that we should be talking about. But if Dosan presents this film to you, he might not highlight, for example, or Hussein, or whoever else was involved. But for me, I think, and it comes through in some points in the film that encounters are also an important theme that we're trying to bring out. But मतलब फिल्म का मकसद ये था कि वायलेंस के बाद लोगों की ज़िंदगी पे उसका क्या असर होता है.
I just wanted to ask if there was sort of, because if there was any kind of organizing or community sort of support lent to families, or sort of maybe people coming together on the issue of grief just at a personal level. We can see with Amna's story that it leads to sort of political organizing, but just on the sort of support side of it, because the other story, there was also a lot of isolation, especially sort of if half of your family is sort of impacted by it. So was there any kind of, like when you were doing maybe the focus groups, any kind of support systems that people were tapping into within the community?
So unfortunately, no. And one of our motivations for putting forward the proposal was we felt like, like this conflict affected Lyari and Karachi for years, and Karachi में भी एक cycle चलता है violence का. You see this cycle repeating again. Abhi bhi it's kind of coming back up again. Like there's again a lot of stories circulating of various violent encounters, and crime is going up, and so there's a kind of Karachi story is like that for the last few decades. And ये होता है, फिर things get really bad, and then एक operation होता है, फिर operation में बहुत लोग मारे जाते हैं और उठाए जाते हैं, and then आहिस्ता आहिस्ता it goes back down, and we were kind of like, for me as a researcher, I thought, what happens? How does all of a sudden सब कहते हैं कि अच्छा हालात सही हो गए हैं? हालात किस तरह से सही हुए हैं? वाकई में हालात ठीक हो गए हैं, लोग खुश हैं, उनको लगता अमन आ गया? Is that really what's happening? Or are people not talking about what's going on, or are they talking privately, or खुल के बात नहीं कर रहे हैं because there's still so much fear? And it was really like, for me, that was a big motivating factor for let's try to explore a little more about what happens after this kind of trauma is experienced by so many people. And I think for a lot of people, those group discussions were, I don't know if therapeutic is the right word, but it gave people an opportunity to share with each other. And even in screening the film as well, there was a lot of, sharing of grief. And so it did give people that kind of space that I don't think really does exist. People are, yes, there's maybe, obviously families में, आपस में, पड़ोसियों के साथ, दोस्तों के साथ, लेकिन there's no real formal dealing with this kind of, and that's not just Lyari, that's all of Karachi, that's all of the conflict affected areas of Pakistan, which is like everywhere almost, right? और कहाँ बात होती है इसके बारे में, like all of the areas in, Balochistan or in Waziristan that have been through years of trauma and conflict, वहाँ कौन बात करता है? I mean, ख़त्म ही नहीं होता conflict वहाँ कि कोई बात करे उसके बारे में. But there's no, way of dealing with that. So this is one attempt, and what we hope is that there would be more, maybe other people in different ways would find, because it's not just about healing, it's also about how do we make sure कि ये चीज़ दोबारा नहीं हो. Like you have to talk together, analysis होनी, because state की तरफ से तो there's no initiative to actually end this conflict. If anything, they're very much invested in continuing the conflict. So, yeah.
I can project. Thank you, Nida. I was really struck by a number of things, but जो मैं बात करना चाह रहा था there was a series of descriptions that जो चाचा हैं उन्होंने दिए लियारी के बारे में. I think he started off by calling. I think multiple times he referred to it as a mother, and I think at one point he called it also as an existence, a way of life, and an identity. Now, what that kind of gestures to me is that this is the distinctive of Lyari as a way of life, as the texture of Lyari. एक तो ज़ाहिर है conflict and the encounters and the violence that you've um, captured so imaginatively. एक तो वो चीज़ है, but it also precedes this, right? I mean, Lyari has a distinctive way of being. कि कराची के अंदर भी या पाकिस्तान के अंदर भी जो लियारी है, it's a very kind of उसकी एक अलग जो पूरी एक पहचान है, एक अलग तरीका है वहाँ पे लोगों का रहने का. So I'm just wondering in your kind of work, even beyond this film, how does this come through in a way that जो एक पुरानी लियारी की distinctiveness है, and then this kind of the layer of violence through which now it has now been broadly perceived. So how does this kind of mix together to create, what you're after, the kind of distinctiveness of the texture of life, as you very evocatively put it in your introduction?
Yeah, I think Lyari is, I'm glad that comes through, because Lyari is, like Chacha Nawaz says, Lyari ek pehchan hai, Lyari ek wajood hai. It's rare to hear somebody speak about their locality in that way, but it's not unheard of. I think Lyari's history is so rich, and people have been, families have been there for generations. I think it's that those older parts of the city tend to have that emotional connection, that sense of place, that sense of identity, that newer settlements generally don't have. Lyari definitely has that. And there's a sense of pride that people have about that identity, that pehchan, that I think comes through, especially with Chacha Nawaz. And we, so that is there, and that's special. And at the same time, there is Lyari's characterization as a no-go area, as a den of crime and violence. And there's a lot of pushback against that. And you can see that with Chacha Nawaz and, and this narrative of Karachi ki maan and all of this. So throughout my time working in this area, I saw this pushback. But also with the pushback, there is a sense of, we've been through something really terrible, or koi uske bare mein baat nahi karta hai. Nobody recognizes the injustice that's been done in this part of Karachi, and there's a sense of wanting to talk about that without taking away from the pride and the beauty of that place. And so those things exist side by side in people's narration of their place, and I think wo film mein bhi aapko nazar aata hai. I don't know what else to say about that, but Lyari has a lot of conflicting narratives that people are also trying to push back against, who are from there. Sometimes it goes the other way. People get upset when you talk about violence. Like a critique that I got of this film from people in Lyari is, itni conflict or violence के बारे में हमेशा लोग क्यों बात करते हैं, Lyari के बारे में क्यों हमेशा सिर्फ violence के ऊपर बात होती है. So there is that, anger about that, and I understand and respect that. At the same time, there is this, I think, a need to also talk about what happened in order to make people aware, and also hopefully not repeat this cycle again in Lyari.
Would you do it if you had the chance? Would you do it again?
in terms of focusing on the macro situation over there, and secondly, the subjects. I'm sorry if it's impolite to say that, but would you rather use younger subjects to focus on what the youth is going through over there?
So I think, yeah, that was a challenge, is how do you provide that macro political economic context that helps explain the micro. And that's always been something that was like a tension between myself and the editor and the director, because as a sociologist, I was always wanting to put more text cards in and explain कि Lyari की history क्या है, और political parties का क्या role रहा है, or state का क्या role, and all the things I said in the intro, I would have wanted to include in the film. But to do so would have really affected the, I think, visual experience of watching it, and the emotional experience as well. And it might have become a different kind of more newsy kind of documentary, which that's also has value. But that's not really what we were trying to do. So I don't know. I don't know if I would ever do it again, or if I would have the opportunity, because who knows? Let's see what life has to offer. But it was, I don't know, it was very challenging to be able to bring that complexity into through this medium in a way that's compelling. So yeah, but I think if we had more time, we could have brought in a little bit more of that macro without it seeming too news kind of focused. There are ways of doing it. So dekhte hain, let's see if there's ever an opportunity. And the second question was younger people. Amna's not that old, she's younger than me. But yeah, in terms of the youth, proper youth, I think focus group discussions mein wo the, but they're also less inclined to expose themselves in that way. They have more to lose, they're more vulnerable. So it would be great to have stories of younger people, but it would also, I think, be even more challenging to do so in a way that's ethical,
Thank you. I just had a very quick question. So, just building off of what Dr. Aman was also saying, I just wanted to ask if, so the title of the documentary, Shadowlands, is that from what Chacha Nawaz was saying, that he's, he feels like he's become a saya ban gaya, I think he says. So it seems like the thing I really appreciated about this documentary was about how it's kind of capturing really the texture of very everyday grief, more than any larger statement. It's really about this very everyday texture of grief amidst what kind of seems like wholesale abandonment and state violence, continuing side by side. And I was wondering if you could maybe elucidate a little more on how so Amna spoke a little bit about what she understands the position of the Baloch in this, right? How it is that the Baloch figure with the encounters, with the violence, and if you could speak a little more about that, and maybe expand on the few things that Amna said.
Yeah, that was another. So for those not familiar with Pakistan, or even people who are in Pakistan often don't know what's happening in Balochistan because of the way the media is controlled. That was another thing. I thought, we're just like throwing it out there that there's enforced disappearances, but somebody watching probably doesn't really understand what's happening. And we didn't know how to bring that in without going off topic as well. But it's part of Amna's life, and it's part of Amna's activism, and it's important for her. It's an important part of her story. And so Amna tells us that after her husband was killed, she has a kind of awakening, like a political awakening, and she starts connecting a lot of dots. And for her, the way the dots were connecting were, she said कि Balochistan में भी बलोचों को मारा जा रहा है, और कराची में भी बलोचों को मारा जा रहा है अपनी ज़बान उनकी ज़बान के बुनियाद पे. So basically she's making a connection between the violence that was very much state supported in Lyari, which is not 100% Baloch area, but it's, has a very significant Baloch population. And she felt that this was part of a wider pattern of targeting Baloch people. And so for her, she started then connecting dots and then started seeing the various human rights abuses that were taking place in Balochistan, one of which is enforced disappearances. And we know that thousands of people have been disappeared in Balochistan and in other parts of Pakistan by the security agencies, by the military. And people have been victims of encounter killings in Balochistan as well. And so she started making connections between all of this. And this really, for her, this was a way of kind of fighting back against her own personal experience of loss and trauma. So she translated that loss and grief into her own activism and resistance. But Amna is exceptional. And I think Chacha Nawaz is more, nobody is like, everyone's exceptional, and Chacha Nawaz is exceptional. But Chacha Nawaz's story might be a little bit more common in Lyari. Amna is, I have friends who are more familiar with the political dynamics of Karachi and Lyari, who are surprised that Amna, as a Baloch woman from Lyari, would be so invested in politics in Balochistan. Because that's not, people care, but to be that invested that you would put yourself at the forefront of, this kind of movement or these campaigns is exceptional.
Congratulations, first of all. बहुत अच्छी थी film आपकी, very affected, very tastefully done with all the emotions of the people. My question was about something you mentioned yourself. एक तो, as a sociologist and also now a filmmaker, there's a tension there in terms of audiences and training. But since you have a relationship with the place and you have also gone on a tour, so question was कि एक तो लियारी में आपने दिखाया, तो उनकी reception, like they talked about the violence bit, but what other emotions were felt? How did they receive it? And then also when you have taken it across the world, how are people connecting to it without all this macro context? Are people receiving it in the way it was intended? Because personally, I think the choice was the right one to not bring in all the textual bit and let the emotions flow. So again, brave choice, but did it pay off?
Very fascinating, really. Maybe you know or not, me and Kasmi also applied this fund, but we couldn't get it. You get it. So first of all. And secondly, really you justify in many, many ways. And it was very moving, powerful, and impactful. And best thing is, what I really, really ask, maybe you're presenting many way other in America, in England, Oxford, and SWAS. I was just thinking, because this audience is different when you was audience in USA and America. Whether that's like, especially for me, people who don't know Lyari or Karachi's landscape and not familiar. But when there's different audience, whether they compare that exceptional story or something same thing happening in Bombay, maybe in Mexico, or something others that's neighborhood, or maybe somebody ask you a question. I don't know. I'm just like, it strike me whether long time ago, if we work in Androon, Lahore, or there was sort of gunda systems or butt or drugs thing was happening, many killing was happen. So I'm just in a comparison mode. Can you say something?
Yeah, and I think those two questions kind of fit nicely together. Thank you, Danielle. I know you're a filmmaker as well, so I really appreciate you. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm still a boring sociologist. I just produced this film. Really, all of the artistic, creative, all of the good things are other people's work. And it seems like I went on a tour. I was teaching in the US last year, and it was nice that people invited me. Aisa koi tour nahi hai formal. People invited me when I was there, so it looked like a tour. And the reception in different places is different. US में, for example, we could talk a lot about police violence and violence, against black men in particular. So there were a lot of parallels that could be drawn there. So people could find resonances. UK में कुछ students थे जो Latin America के थे. They also had experienced in their own cities very similar, like, so Rio has gone through very similar, I don't like saying worse, but more people were killed, and similar patterns of violence in various Latin American cities, in the Caribbean as well, in Africa. So those students were there in the UK, they were able to, India mein, of course, like Bombay, I think earlier today I talked about this film with a different audience, and they were saying that Bombay mein, they don't have the same kind of weaponization that Karachi has. But India, many places, especially UP, Bihar, but even Bombay, encounter killings are very common there. So a lot of Indian students would talk about that experience. Kashmiri students from Indian occupied Kashmir had a lot, so people find, because everyone, unfortunately, especially in this region, has some connection with conflict and trauma and violence, and living in Lahore mein bhi, I'm sure there are similar stories that people can tell. And people have been killed in encounter killings in Punjab, actually in huge numbers. So, there could be a lot of resonance and parallels with that. And Lyari, the reception was mostly good, very emotional. I really, of course, for me, screening it there was the most important and most meaningful, and I wish I could have done the first screenings there, but I wasn't in the country at the time. We also screened it in Malir, in Karachi. So the Aman Committee actually had set up kind of offices in Malir, in Moachkot, in Kirmani, in other areas of the city with similar ethnic profiles. I wouldn't just say just Baloch, but with the older communities that have been in Karachi since well before partition. So they also related a lot, because Malir also experienced this in different ways. So of course, screening it with people who've been through it is the most kind of emotionally moving and, for me, important aspect of this whole thing. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Nida. We must say thank you to for bringing this documentary and so many human experiences, micro level and macro level observations. We look forward to more work on Lyari. You're absolutely right, and we don't even do an iota of work on conflict related aspects of life, neither at the level